We're going to be continuing in the 17th book of Israel. And chapter 37. And the title of this one is Work on Your Cookbook Recipes. Last great day afternoon comments and closing prayer from Pastor. This is a short sermon here. Okay. So, it starts out with the praise to Yahweh. And then Pastor said, I want to take you back in history a ways. When we get our power, we're going to heal all the sick who reverence Yahweh, those who reverence Yahweh. The food and the cookbooks, if you remember, we have some examples that are given to us. Yahweh says those examples are given to us so we won't stumble and fall as many did in the wilderness. And it's important that we get familiar with the examples that are written in Scripture, because they are there for our learning. We gain from their experiences written down for us. And it's very interesting to make a study of it. Whether you're talking about in Genesis, whether you're talking about in the Judges, Samuel, and the history. We learn a lot. We can learn a lot. The life of David is an example also, because Yahweh gave testimony that David was a man after his own heart. And in studying what David went through and the judgments that he made and how he was very reverent to Shaul, even though Shaul was hunting him, and the loyalty that he showed. These are things that are lessons to us. It says the children of Israel, Yahweh says those examples are given to us so that we won't stumble and fall in as many did in the wilderness. If you remember, when Moshe led the children of Israel out of Egypt, they were lacking in meat. Yahweh fed them with manna. They didn't know what it was. They were eating, but they knew it came from Yahweh, so they didn't argue about it. He also gave them quail to eat in the wilderness. This was when they first came out of Egypt and they came to Abelin, or Sinai. I think the great Kohan Yehuda has already brought that information out on Sinai. Before 70 AY, study the history. Please try to listen as you're busy getting settled. Try to listen to me, because before they destroyed the temple in 70 AD, they had already done many things. These things were done even before Yeshua came and was murdered by Yada. This is plain. It's made very clear to you in Acts 7 that it was the 12 tribes who murdered Yeshua with their army, as Daniel showed in Daniel 11, verse 31. But before they destroyed the temple in 70 AY, they had already taken millions of people captive. They took them to Babylon. I told you Babylon was a province. It was a large province. It was a huge area. It took a lot of acres and towns and countries in that time, because the fourth beast was growing. It was getting big and monstrous. This was the fourth beast that was made up of three before it. The leading time period of those four beasts came in the last part, when they had the Pope as the mouthpiece. They created them a mouthpiece in the Vatican, the divining serpent called the shots. They built this huge army, and later in history we see how strong it was when the soldiers went to dying like flies from their own diseases that they themselves caused. Before they destroyed the temple in 70 AY, that was 70 years after Yeshua, they had already started taking captives. We see this in the history of the kings. Very little is told, but they did it all the time. They took captives and kept building up this army, this huge army in Babylon and in Rome. Rome didn't just start overnight. It was about 700 years in the making there, and they were building this huge army that they intended to rule the world with forever. They wouldn't do it, but that was their plan. They couldn't do it, but that was their plan. In 70 AY, the four beasts made their move to Rome, took the temple to Rome. It's now called the Sistine Chapel. It's exactly the same measurements as the temple. And I think the last time I was here, I had an article that pointed this out. Everything is the same. If it quacks, it must be a duck, right? Well, it does. It quacks. Every measurement, even the Holy of Holies, is the same. I didn't even know it was the temple when I heard about it. We saw it from outside when we were in Rome at a so-called peace conference there. It was put on for show, but mostly to gather information, I think. But anyway, we witnessed to them. We wanted to go into this chapel and do more witnessing, but it was closed for repairs. They moved all the materials from the temple to Rome in 70 AY. They moved their headquarters. They killed millions of people. Some sources say 3 million. Some say 30 million. The ones they couldn't make slaves of to put to work, they would kill them. They would take the slaves and put them on projects. They'd offer them jobs and security. They gave them all kinds of promises. If it was a secret project, they put them on. After the project was finished, they killed them so they couldn't talk about it or report what they had done. I suspect this is what took place with those who moved the temple to Rome and set it up. The secret is out now. They're trying to make alibis and all kinds of excuses, but that's it. They kept the book of Yahweh hidden for 1,500 years. All these things are according to prophecy. Jerusalem, Israel, was destroyed, totally destroyed. It was like the top of a mountain. There was nothing there. When they got through destroying it, there was nothing there. I remember studying about this with Yaakov, my brother, after the German war, when the Vatican decided they had to wipe out more Sabbath keepers, which they did. They say 6 million. It might have been another 30 million. We don't know. They suspect they killed around 6 million other countries. Other countries besides Germany did the same thing. Many of them are recorded. More than 6 million Sabbath keepers in their countries, and they were all gotten rid of. This was something else. The Sabbath keepers don't like to pay tithes to the Vatican. The people who keep Yahweh's laws don't like to pay this tribute to the Vatican. Many years after Jerusalem was destroyed, I remember the Hebrew people wanted to go back there. The thing I remember the most was Britain was in charge of that area. They had let the Muslims come in. They took tribute from them. Everything was satisfactory until the Hebrew people started wanting to come back to Israel. This was brought about, and I remember Jacob and I saying this was going to be brought about. I also remember the arguments that came with the Christians during the 6-day war. They were allowing about 1,100 a week or something like that of Hebrews to go back to Israel. There were incidences where there were 100,000 or more going back to Israel. Israel was very skinny in the 40s. Between 1945 and 1948 was when the biggest group of people under the push and shove of the United States went back into Israel. They set up a nation. I remember David Ben-Gurion was one of the ones. Rabin was another. He was a young military officer at the time. Rabin was the one who later signed the 7-year peace treaty, the last part of which we're waiting on right now. I remember the Christians saying certain things in the 60s when Egypt decided they didn't want the Hebrews there. And that's an interesting, they have a documentary on YouTube on the 6-day war. It's very interesting. Egypt went into Israel to kill them. Remember, Egyptians are Coptic Catholics. The Vatican, although they're separated from Egypt in appearance, they are still working together. Egypt was sent in 1967. That was the same year Yahweh brought me to Abelin, 1967. Egypt tried to go in and destroy all the Sabbath keepers, again, because they were wanting to keep the Sabbath. That was the main thing, and the Hebrews didn't want to pay tribute to Rome. But you won't hear about any of this in any of these documentaries. So Egypt moved in to destroy the Hebrews again and wipe them out, but it didn't work. I remember Jacob and I arguing with Christians at that time because Egypt was threatening to drive the Hebrew people into the sea. And we said, no, that is not going to be. They're being taken back there by Yahweh, and they're being protected because of the fact that they have to be offered the truth again in these last days. There's a lot of prophecy that takes place with what land in these with that land in these last days. And I mean, it was really something when this thing started, and Israel was just mowing them down. It's like, wow, because there was so much of them, and the Arabs were joining the Egyptians to stand up against Israel. So it was like a David and Goliath scene. Let me tell you a big mistake that the historians and the commentators are making. They're getting the prophecies mixed up with the history. There is the history of the great destruction that took place in 70 AY, and also the prophecies of what is to take place in the last days. The last days don't refer to the 70 year, don't refer to 70 AY. That was the time period when Yeshua was killed to pay for our sins. Ever since that time, Yeshua has been sitting at the side of Yahweh, training to be high priest over the house of Yahweh. He's training to take over that job completely. At the same time, he's practicing the job in this period, in this time period. While he's sitting there, he's practicing under the leadership of Yahweh. All of those things are taking place right now. It's a long process that is taking place. You can imagine Yeshua is high anticipation. Britain and the Vatican, meaning dividing serpent, were in charge of the land of Israel from 70 AY until 1967, when they had that 6-day war, and Israel wiped out the Egyptians and sent them running back to Egypt. Before that, back in Russia was supplying Egypt with the MiGs, and the Israelis got all the MiGs while they were still on the ground. They flew in below the radar, and they had absolutely no warning, none. All of these things are prophesied in your scriptures. Don't get it mixed up with the last days in your studies. The last days are always identified as just that, the end or the last days, the last generation, when the sinners will destroy sinners. In 1982, I went to Israel for the first time, and I experienced what the children of Israel experienced when they came out of Egypt. There was no meat in Israel at that time. In 1982, we were in the Golan Heights. We went there for a reason, but we stayed there overnight getting information. They served what they said was a steak. I didn't know what they made it out of, but I think it had something to do with soybeans and corn. The way it tasted, it wasn't beef. There was a man I used to know named Don Montgomery. He was a close friend of mine. He and his family, he was an agriculture teacher, and he came to the services with Jacob and I. He moved to Israel. I believe it was 79 when he moved to Israel, but I'm not sure about that date. But I think it's close. So when We went to Israel in 82. We got off the bus and walked to his house. It was nothing to me to walk, but when they found out I had walked for like 7 miles from the bus stop to his house, they were horrified because they told me how dangerous it was that time for us to be out there walking. Israel was a dangerous place, and everybody was carrying guns. Everybody had guns strapped on their sides. Every man and woman, everyone was required to be a soldier, own a gun and carry a gun when they went anywhere. They were always soldiers there. Soldiers after when they went through this army training. That still goes on. All the children are required to do that in Israel. But I went back to Montgomery's house, and he asked me how I was doing. I said I was like the children of Israel. I'm meat hungry, and this is leading up to the whole point of this section here. I said I was like the children of Israel. I was meat hungry. I said I didn't realize I would miss meat that much. He said, I'm going to take you to Jerusalem tomorrow, and I'm going to buy you something that will save your life. So this is talking about meat here. You notice one of the movements that is taking place is to discourage meat eating. Okay? And what I feel that's all about is population reduction. Population reduction. Because this is one of the things that poor people have, is their little cattle and their poultry. And they want to get people out of that, blaming global warming on the cows. This is the craziness that is going on. Well, it was this lowly falafel. So the falafel is what the Mr. Montgomery bought pasta. I've worked to get that recipe. I think we've got it to perfection now, and of course we've enjoyed that. And if you could see how Pastor is being led by Yahweh all throughout his whole life to provide for us in these last days, I think we're going to really come to appreciate what Pastor has done in preparing us and bringing us to where we are today, as the days get more terrible. So may Yahweh bless your understanding with that. If you all please stand. And welcome our next teacher, the great Khan, David Heimerman.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Please be seated. We're going to pick up where the great Khan David left off. And we're going to start on page 438. And this is chapter 37 of the 17th book of Yisrayl, He Who Rules as Yahweh. And the title of this book is The Greatest Gathering of All Times. And the title of the sermon here this evening is Work on Your Cookbook Recipes. And this was the afternoon comments and closing prayer from Yahweh's Last Days Witness, Yisrael Hawkins, that he gave on 10/13 of 17. And so beginning at the top of page 428, he's talking about President Trump's request for more bombs on page 437 here, and the fact that the Congress cut him back a little short on what he asked for. But Pastor picks it up here then on page 438. He says, even their intelligence is telling the world it's going to be over within 30 minutes to an hour. and he's talking about the capabilities with nuclear weapons here. He says, Pastor says, it's so strange because prophecy says it's going to be over within an hour. 1 hour burning. That's the limit that Yahweh has given them in Revelation 18. And I'd like to read some verses from Revelation 18, which talks about the 1 hour burning that Pastor is referring to here. And if you have your books of Yahweh, in Revelation chapter 18, verses 4, 5, 6, we'll start there. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, "Come out of her, my people." And that's what Yahweh does when he calls us to his house. Come out of this world and learn Yahweh's way and reverence Yahweh, so that you do not partake of her sins, and so that you do not receive of her plagues. And the 1 hour burning could be considered one of the plagues that is being referred to here. For her sins have reached unto heaven, and Yahweh has remembered her iniquities. Render to her just as she rendered to you, and repay her double according to her works. In the cup which she has mixed for her double. And I believe it's in Revelation 13, which says, he who is for war must be killed by war, and he who is for the sword must be destroyed that way. So that's what's being referred to here also. In verse 8 of Revelation chapter 18, therefore her plagues will come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be utterly burned with fire, for strong is Father Yahweh who judges her. Just as the Apostle Kepha said, in these last days destruction will come with fire. Verse 17, for in 1 hour, there it is, for in 1 hour such great riches came to nothing, and every sea captain and all the company in ships, the sailors and all who earned their living from the sea stood afar off and cried when they saw the smoke of her burning. And this is talking about the destruction of New York City actually here, but this is a worldwide nuclear war that's coming. What city is like this great city? And they did cast dust on their heads, and cried, weeping and wailing, saying, Alas, alas, that great city, in which all who had ships in the sea were made rich through her wealth. For in 1 hour, there's it again, a second witness in this same chapter here, for in 1 hour she is made desolate. And we're going to read 21 and 24 in this chapter 18 yet. And a mighty Malach took up a stone like a great millstone and cast it into the sea, saying, in this way, with violence, will that great city Babylon be thrown down and will be found no more at all. For in her was found the blood of the prophets and of saints and of all who were slain upon the earth. And you can look at the way the Yadaim treated Yeshua, and they devised a way to murder him, and they did according to what the prophets said. And the same thing was true about many of the prophets, including the apostle Shaul. They said that did the same thing to him. So continuing where Pastor is talking about here, he says, how can you justify unbelief with prophecy like this? The intelligence of the government is backing it up. They're saying, yes, the earth can be burned in an hour, 1 hour's time. Yet this prophecy was recorded in 96 AY, and that's just what the book of Revelation, which I just read from, was recorded. Revelation was written in 96 AY, after Yeshua's birth. In verse 33 here, the nuclear bomb wasn't invented until the knowledge was increased, as Daniel said it would be. It wasn't started until 1934. That same year, the computer was started that everything runs on today. The computer has basically revolutionized society, from the smartphones to the artificial intelligence to the internet. Everything is run by computers. You can do an amazing search on Google, and you get 20 million results in half a second, or whatever they come up with. But it's quick, very quick. Pastor says here, it's also the eyes and ears. They have many eyes on America. And this is talking about satellites. It's talking about the satellite technology that's circling the earth, countries spying on each other. And if you can get this in your mind, up until 1934, the doctors traveled with the buggy pulled by a mule or a horse up until 1934, the year that I was born. And what Pastor's referring to here is the prophecy, the words of Yeshua that talk about that in this last generation. And, the witness, Yisrayl Hawkins, born in 1934, represents this last generation, this nuclear generation we're living in. Daniel saw me, Pastor says here, he continues, Daniel saw me before that and talked to me. Yahweh actually let him talk to me. Daniel saw both witnesses, but he only talked with me. And if you remember what Pastor has told us about he and his brother, they had a radio talk show in 1962 in Eastland, Texas, where the format was JG, or Jacob Hawkins, his brother, the other witness, would ask the question, and Bill, Yisrayl, would answer the question. So it was a question and answer program with the witness Jacob asking the question, and the witness Yisrayl Hawkins, named Buffalo Bill at that time, he would answer the question. So, but what Pastor's saying here about Daniel saw me and actually talked with me, I've got a couple of references to that, and they're found in the book of Daniel. So I'd like to start in in Daniel chapter 12, for example. There's 3 different chapters here. There may be more, but these are the 3 I'm aware of. In Daniel chapter 12, verse 4, But you, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book to the time of the end. Many will run to and fro, and knowledge will be increased. And we just talked about computers, the increase in knowledge, artificial intelligence, all of these things. Communication is instant. This is an increase in knowledge compared to the time prior to 1934. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, there stood 2 others. Now this is the 2 witnesses. Yahweh is showing Daniel 2,400 years ago, these last days. Daniel had dreams and visions, and Yahweh allowed Daniel to see the witness Yisrayl in these last days, and to talk to him in his visions, and to receive the answers and an explanation of what Daniel was actually seeing. Verse 5 of Daniel chapter 12. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, there stood 2 others, one on this side of the bank of the river, and the other on that side of the bank of the river. And one said to the man clothed in linen, and pastors explained to us that he wears linen, except for the leather belt around his waist, and his leather shoes, but he is dressed in linen. He is the one described here as the one dressed in linen, who on that future day is teaching. How long will it be to the end of these wonders? Then I heard the man, so Daniel's being able to get understanding in speaking to Yisrayl Hawkins here in his dreams, visions. Then I heard the man clothed in linen, who on that future day is teaching here at the house of Yahweh, and we are his seed. We are the benefactors of his teaching. When he held up his right hand and left hand toward heaven, and vowed by him who lives, it will be for a time, times and a half, when Yahweh will have accomplished pouring out his power through his holy people, all things will be finished. These last days we're living in, time, times, and half a time. This is the peace treaty, for example, which was signed and went into effect October 13th of 1993. Time, and a half a time. The House of Yahweh in the wilderness, time, and half a time. This is a characteristic feature, an identifying feature of this time period we're living in. And, the witness Yisrayl allowed Daniel to understand this time period. I'd like to go over to Daniel chapter 8. Then I heard one saint speaking to another saint. So this is Jacob speaking to Yisrayl, and said to him, the one that spoke, "How long will the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the setting up of the Lord of heaven, and the surrender of the sanctuary, and the host be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be cleansed." And I believe what this is talking about. This is Daniel. He served the Babylonian emperor Nebuchadnezzar, and later on Cyrus for a shorter period of time, the second empire, the Medes and the Persians. But this 2,300 days, if you take the time from when Alexander the Great came on the scene and conquered the world basically in 12 years, but from that time up until 1962 was 2,300 years. Now in Yekeskel chapter 4, it speaks of one prophetic day being a year. 2,300 days, 2,300 years. Up until 1962, when the two witnesses started their ministering together for 28 years, from 1962 to 1990, where the witness Jacob died in 1991. So when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, was searching to understand this meaning, and behold, that there stood before me one having the appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice between the banks of the river Ulai, who called out and said, "Man of Yahweh, make this man understand the vision." So, the witness Yisrayl is being instructed to make Daniel understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he approached, I was frightened and fell down on my face, and he said to me, "Understand, O son of man, for the fulfillment of that vision belongs to events that will take place," notice, in the time of the end. Right here in this last generation, the time of the end. Now, as he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face toward the ground, Daniel said. But he touched me and set me upright on my feet. And he said, "Behold, I will make you to know what will be in the last day of indignation." Who would know but the ones living in that last days, the ones teaching it? For at the time appointed, the end will be. And the third reference I have here to what Pastor is saying here, he says, Daniel saw me before that and talked to me. Yahweh actually let him talk to me. Daniel saw both witnesses, but he only talked to me. Yahweh had me explain to him what I would be preaching at that time period. And so the third reference here is from Daniel chapter 7. Now Daniel had a vision in chapter 7. He had a vision. And in verse 15 here, he said, I, Daniel, after he described the vision, he said, I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit within my body, and the visions that passed through my mind troubled me. You know, he saw these kingdoms, these beastly kingdoms, and what they would do. I came near to one of the two witnesses. It doesn't say of the two witnesses, but I'm saying that's who he saw. I came near to one of those who stood by and asked him the truth of all this. And he told me and revealed the interpretation of these things to me. These great beasts are four kings who will arise out of the earth. But notice the end result of this time period we're living in, verse 18. The bottom line, the event we're all looking forward to, entering into Yahweh's rest. Verse 18, but the saints of Yahweh will take the kingdom, Yeshua will return, take the kingdom by force, and will possess the kingdom forever. Yes, forever and ever. So getting back to Pastor's sermon here in the afternoon of the last great day, he says, how can unbelief justify yourself? How can unbelief justify yourself there? You people all over the world, you need to pay attention You need to pay attention to the house of Yahweh. This is your life. These prophecies tell it correctly. There's no lying or variation. They are 100% true. All the prophecies of Yahweh are being governed by Yahweh. He put them there and inspired them to be written. And as the book of Yahweh says, Isaiah 34:16, not one of these words will fail. Not one. Yahweh is absolutely perfect. When this is all over with, everyone will be amazed to see that Yahweh did not miss one detail. Not one point will he miss that will not come to pass. They were gathered together for us, even by the enemy. The books of Yahweh, the priest, the unrighteous priest who gathered up these documents and hid them away, they're available to us today. Yahweh made certain of that, as pastors explained many times about the book of Yahweh. They did it for money, of course. They said there were billions of dollars in this book. People would pay billions of dollars for these manuscripts. Well, Yahweh saw to it that they did. He gave the law, search out the book of Yahweh and read. Yahweh had to produce the book of Yahweh. In 1987, that's when the first edition of the book of Yahweh came out, it came back to life again. I went to Israel for the first time in 82, Pastor says. 5 years after that, the book of Yahweh was printed and put out to the people in 1987. I can't see how there could be unbelief in Yahweh's prophecies when they're so accurate like this. It's not like they're hit and miss. Well, in Daniel chapter 9, right now, Rabin was the general who helped to establish the state of Israel. I think in 1948, maybe, Pastor says here, I'm not sure. I can't keep up with all of these dates. I have a little information on Yitzhak Rabin because, and we'll read Daniel chapter 9, but Yitzhak Rabin was one of the co-signers with Yasser Arafat of the peace treaty in Washington, D.C. on September 13th of 1993. And this is a little bit of biography here about Yitzhak Rabin. It says, this is from Wikipedia, it says Yitzhak Rabin, he was born 1 March 1922, so he was born 4 years before the witness Jacob was born, and 12 years before the witness Yeshua was born. And he died on 4 November 1995. Was an Israeli politician, statesman, and general. He was the 5th Prime Minister of Israel, serving 2 terms in office from 1974 to 77 and 1992. So he was in office when the peace treaty was signed in 93, until his assassination in 1995. Rabin was born in Jerusalem to Ukrainian Jewish immigrants and raised in a labor Zionist household. He learned agriculture in school and excelled as a student. He led a 27-year career as a soldier. As a teenager, he joined the commando unit of the Yeshuv. He eventually rose through its ranks to its chief of operations during Israel's War of Independence, and this preceded 1948, when the nation of Israel was established or declared. He joined the newly formed Israeli Defense Forces in late 1948 and continued to rise as a promising officer. He helped shape the training doctrine of the IDF in the early 1950s and led the Israeli Defense Forces Operations Directorate from 59 to 63. He was appointed Chief of General Staff in 1964 and oversaw Israel's victory in the 1967 Six-Day War. Now that's quite an impressive accomplishment for an individual here. But continuing here, because in 67 was when Israel took over the Golan Heights, they defeated Egypt and the other Arab coalition that came against them, and they regained territory in Jerusalem, and got established in Jerusalem. Took the Temple Mount for a while until they gave it back to Jordan's care. But Rabin served as Israel's ambassador to the United States from 1968 to 73 during a period of deepening U.S.-Israeli ties. He was appointed Prime Minister of Israel in 74 after the resignation of Golda Meir. In his first term, Rabin signed the Sinai Interim Agreement and ordered the Entebbe raid. He resigned in 77 in the wake of a financial scandal. Rabin was Israel's Minister of Defense for much of the 1980s, including the outbreak of the First Intifada. In 92, Rabin was reelected as Prime Minister on a platform embracing the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. So he's been a soldier all his life, but he's embracing the peace process here. He signed several historic agreements with the Palestinian leadership as part of the Oslo Accords. In 1994, Rabin won the Nobel Peace Prize together with longtime politician Shimon Peres and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. Rabin also signed the peace treaty with Jordan in 1994. In November 1995, he was assassinated by an extremist who opposed the Oslo Accords. Rabin was the first native-born Prime Minister of Israel, the only Prime Minister to be assassinated. Rabin has become a symbol of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. So I'd like to read here in Daniel chapter 9 here, verse 27. This is the prophecy that Pastor is referring to here. Let me just say here, read it here. The prophecy talked about Rabin, Pastor says, and said this 7-year covenant would be made with Rabin. It actually gives his name. A 7-year peace treaty would be confirmed with Rabin. That's in Daniel chapter 9. It stayed in operation for 3.5 years, and then it was shut down. In the midst of the week of years, it would be shut down. So in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27, it says, and he, Rabin, it says, and he will confirm a covenant with many. Now the many is Rab. In Hebrew, the word, it's Hebrew word 7227, many. It's Rab. It means abundant, and it comes from 7231, Rabab, but which interpreted Rabin, gives his very name. The Hebrew word here gives the very name of the man who would be one of the signers of the peace treaty. For 1 week, 7 years, and in the midst of the week, he will cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. Yes, Netanyahu, who's prime minister now, also again, he shut it down in the spring of 1997. And the obligation to cease. Instead, he will cause the prevalence of the Lord of heaven, even until the destruction that is determined will be poured out upon the desolator. So continuing on in Pastor's sermon here, he says, Netanyahu is back in office today, but they're trying to get him impeached, and he is in serious trouble with, according to some reports. But anyway, he's still in office. They're going to make a deal according to Trump. I believe the deal is already made. I think they're going to confirm it again and put the 3.5 years back into action. The reason they're doing this is to get the Vatican off their backs. The Vatican has a lot of pressure against Israel, and almost all nations have turned against Israel at this time because of what's going on. It's interesting to me that after the peace treaty was signed in 1993, went into effect October 13 of 1993, a month and a half later, on 12/30/93, the Vatican, the Pope, recognized the state of Israel. Now, we read earlier that the state of Israel was actually established in 48, And I'm sure there were times when other entities took to recognize Israel, but the Vatican did not recognize Israel until a month and a half after the peace treaty was signed. Why? Because there was a two-state solution that was part of it, and the leader of the kings of the earth, the Vatican, wanted to recognize Israel first of all as a formality, and then, but then the other interesting thing about this, on 6/26 of 2015, the Vatican recognized the state of Palestine. The state of Palestine. So now you have the leader of the kings of the earth having recognized both of the parties in the two-state solution, Israel and Palestine. So that occurred, the recognition of the state of Palestine, 6/26 of 2015. Okay, continuing here. Israel, Pastor says, Israel, although they're squashed in the news media, Israel is having big-time problems. They've got uprisings, and he's talking about the Intifada. He's talking about a couple of years ago, there was more of random killing by Palestinian attacks on Israeli citizens, and some of those things were going on then. But down here in verse 43, Pastor says, and Yahweh tells me, don't worry, I'm going to get you through it. He is, Pastor says, he can take us through it. Yahweh doesn't lie. No, he's 100% accurate. You can trust our Heavenly Father Yahweh. When he says something, he means it, and you can fully depend on it 100%. 100%. In verse 43 here, I have in Revelation, as a reference to that, scriptural reference to it, Revelation 3, verse 7, and to the Malik of the congregation of the House of Yahweh, who is our overseer, Yisrayl Abel Hawkins, these things says he who is holy, who is true, he who has the key of David, speaking of Yeshua here, he who opens and no man shuts, and shuts and no man opens. I know your works, Yisrael Hawkins, seventh heir of the House of Yahweh. I know your works. Behold, I have set before you an open door. The technology that allows this work to reach all the world at this time, never ever before possible to the degree that it is today. Behold, I have set before you an open door, and no man can shut it, for you have a little strength, and have kept my word, and have not denied my name. Behold, I will give out of those of the assemblage of the accuser who preach themselves to be those who reverence Yahweh, and they are not. They will attempt to deceive by falsehood. Behold, I will appoint them for the purpose of worshiping in the presence of your footstool. And that's coming. That's coming also. And they will understand that I loved you, House of Yahweh. Because you have kept the word of my patience, I will also keep you from the hour of temptation, from this 1 hour burning that we read about earlier, which will come upon all the world to test those who dwell upon the earth. Behold, I come quickly, Yeshua says, hold fast that which you have, that no man take your crown. So, and Pastor says here, speaking of Yahweh, he's not like a man. He doesn't have to lie about anything. He's 100% dependable, and that's the message that we're taking to the world. Right now, his word is the prophecies. He foretells his moves. Yes, he does. He foretells his moves. Yahweh tells us exactly what to look for and what he's going to do. He foretells everything he's going to do and everything that is going to come to pass. When this thing is over, you're going to be ruling the universe, brothers and sisters and children. That's your job. You're going to resurrect the dead. The sons and daughters of Yahweh are busy, it says here, doing their jobs, attending classes, doing the work of Yahweh in these last days.